Hey everyone, welcome to Wealth Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Reynolds, certified financial planner, owner of Elevation Financial. Thanks for joining me today as always. Glad to have you here. Should I form an LLC for my business activity? We're going to answer that question today and talk through it a bit. So there are many paths to generating income. Often the W-2 route makes sense as a career path, and that can really pay off and create wealth. Others pursue entrepreneurship and generate income through starting a business or through consulting work as an independent contractor or some sort of self-employment pursuit. Some people do both. There's no one size fits all. So when you're starting a business or providing service through a non-employee route, so self-employed, starting a business, a lot of people wonder how to structure the business. What is the proper business structure? What is the ideal structure for you? And we're going to talk through the LLC structure specifically. It's one of a handful of different business structures people often choose. One is sole proprietorship. One is LLC, which we're talking about today. One is S Corp, C Corp as well. Those are some of the common business structures you see out there. But the LLC, which stands for Limited Liability Company, it's very common. It's a really common type of business structure, and there's a good reason for that. It's very convenient. It's easy to establish. It comes with quite a few benefits. And so we're going to talk through if you should form an LLC for your business activity, how to think through that, how to decide. So let's recap again. What is an LLC? LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. It's a type of business structure that combines the benefits of partnership or sole proprietorship with the protection of personal assets that come with incorporation. So the ease of use, so to speak, of some of the more simpler structures, along with the liability protection of the corporate structure. So with an LLC, the business is a separate legal entity from the owners. The owners are known as members. If you see the word member, that means owner of an LLC. So therefore, the LLC, which is the business, can enter into contracts, own property, conduct business in the business name, just like a corporation would. But in theory, the members of the LLC are not typically liable for the LLC's debts and liabilities as long as you follow certain rules and guidelines, which we'll talk about later. So LLCs are a really popular choice for small businesses and startups, mainly because they're very simple and inexpensive to set up and maintain, but they do provide that flexibility and liability protection. In the U.S., to my knowledge, the first LLC was formed in 1977 when the state of Wyoming enacted the first LLC statute, and then other states began to adopt similar statutes in the following years. Florida, Delaware, and California were some of the early adopters of the LLC. So by the early 1990s, all 50 states had the LLC statute, and the popularity of the LLC as a business structure really began to take off and grow rapidly after that. So again, today, the LLC is one of the most popular and common forms of business organization in the U.S., mainly for small and medium-sized businesses. So what are the advantages of an LLC? So why form an LLC? What are the benefits? So there are quite a few advantages to forming an LLC, and they are as follows. The main advantage most people think of is limited liability. One of the primary benefits of forming an LLC is that it provides limited liability protection for its members, which again are the owners. And this means that the personal assets of the owner are generally protected from the debts and liabilities of the business. So if the LLC gets sued or goes bankrupt, the owner's personal assets are typically not at risk. Also, tax flexibility. The LLC offers tax flexibility in how the structure of the owner is taxed. By default, the LLC is taxed as a pass-through entity, which is most common, and that means the profits and losses of the business are passed through to the owner and reported on their personal tax return. However, LLCs can also be chosen to tax as a corporation if it makes sense. You've got tax flexibility as an option. I will say, though, the vast majority of LLCs are pass-through entities. It's also easy to form and maintain. LLCs are pretty easy to set up. They're inexpensive, pretty easy to maintain, generally fewer formal requirements, less paperwork. So it's just an easier structure to set up and maintain and less expensive. There's also a lot of management flexibility. LLCs offer flexibility in management, which allow members to choose whether to manage the business themselves, hire a separate management team, a lot of flexibility there. And transferability. Ownership in an LLC is transferable through the sale of membership interest, which can make it easier for owners to exit the business if they choose to. So overall, the advantages of forming an LLC make it a really popular choice for small businesses And entrepreneurs who want the liability protection, that tax flexibility, and management flexibility in that easy to maintain business structure. So as a contrast, sole proprietorship offers no such liability protection. The sole proprietor structure does not have the liability protection. The sole proprietor is the default entity type if no business entity is formed, which means the owner's personal assets like your house, bank accounts can be exposed in the event of a lawsuit. So if you just basically start a business, open a business bank account, start providing service, your default entity is sole proprietorship. That's kind of the default. But again, there's no liability protection that comes with that. So in fact, I've heard many attorneys recommend setting up an LLC as soon as you start your business, just so you have that liability protection from the start. So that's kind of the difference between LLC and sole proprietorship. So what about disadvantages? What are the disadvantages of an LLC? So LLCs, again, can be really useful when starting a business. It's not ideal for 100% of situations. There's never a one size fits all. So, some business owners do choose to remain sole proprietorship. So a single member LLC, meaning a single owner, and a sole proprietorship are two different business structures with their own advantages and disadvantages. But some of the disadvantage of an LLC compared to a sole proprietorship are the slightly increased complexity is one. A single member LLC is more complex. It's a more complex business structure, requires a little more paperwork, some more legal formalities. You've got to file articles of organization with the state, possibly maintain an operating agreement. So slightly increased complexity. I say slightly because it's not that much more, but there is some increased complexity. Also, slightly higher costs. If there are going to be additional costs associated with setting up and maintaining the LLC, the filing fees, the annual fees. So slightly higher costs as well. And again, slightly means different things in different states too. So some states charge more than others for LLC fees. More formalities. So a single member LLC is required to follow more formalities than a sole proprietorship. You're supposed to hold annual meetings and keep minutes of those meetings, even if it's a meeting with yourself, so to speak, and just kind of keep records. Also, the limited tax flexibility. It's taxed as a separate entity from its owner, which means that the owner can't use personal tax deductions for LLC expenses. So a little bit of a difference in tax flexibility. So, the advantages and disadvantages of each business structure really depends on your specific situations and goals. We'll talk a little more about that here shortly. And as always, I want to remind you, it's generally a really good idea to consult with a legal or financial professional who can help you make an informed decision when you're comparing the pros and cons. All right, how do I form an LLC? So the process for forming an LLC can vary from state to state, but generally, here are the steps you take to form an LLC. First, choose a name. The LLC's name has to be unique and not already in use by another business in your state. So you want to go to your state's Secretary of State website and do a search and check the availability of your name by searching the state's business name database. So always do a search. Also, as a side, it's not a bad idea to also check for trademarks. You want to make sure you don't choose a name that's trademarked already at the federal level. So maybe go to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and do a search there as well. Then file articles of organization. This is a legal document that you file with your state. Typically includes your LLC's name, address, name of its members, which is just you if you're the only owner. This can typically be done online. I think every state pretty much lets you do this online. So that's going to be the process you go through. You're also going to need to appoint a registered agent during the process. A registered agent is a person or an entity that is just designated to receive legal and tax documents on behalf of the LLC. This is typically going to be you, but you can also use a registered agent service. They're pretty low cost as well. You might need to draft an operating agreement. That's a legal document that outlines the internal rules and structure of your LLC, including management, ownership, profit sharing. If your business is really simple, it's not always going to be necessary. Many states allow you to just skip it. So if you're a very simple business, you may not need that. You may be able to just skip it. Licenses and permits. If your particular type of business and your state or location or county or city requires certain licenses or permits, you would need to obtain those, obviously. Also, get an EIN. An EIN stands for Employer Identification Number. This is the tax identification number that's issued by the IRS. You'll need an EIN to open a business bank account, file taxes, and hire employees if you ever decide to. So you get an EIN. It's free from the IRS website. If you go to irs.gov/EIN, I believe you should find it there. If not, Google it, but make sure you're on the irs.gov website. There are lots of fake sites out there trying to take your money to do it for you. Getting an EIN is free, so do it from the IRS. And then file annual reports and pay fees that may be incurred. So most states require LLCs to file an annual report and pay a small fee to maintain their status. So again, you can do this online directly with your state's website. There are also some online services that can help you with the process and make it easier. They offer kind of a streamlined experience, and some examples include Rocket Lawyer, LegalZoom, Zen Business. No affiliation or endorsement is implied here. They're simply examples. Of course, it can also be a good idea to consult with an attorney to form your LLC. If your business is fairly simple, you might be fine doing it yourself. But if you're uncomfortable with the process or have more complex needs, consulting with a qualified attorney licensed in your state can be a really good way to make sure you're doing it correctly. So never feel hesitant if you want to get some help from an attorney who can help you through that process. All right. So what does it cost to form an LLC? The cost will vary depending on your state and your circumstances. If you're doing it yourself through your state's website, your only cost will be the filing fees that are determined by your state. Some states are pretty inexpensive. Can be as low as $100 or less even. Others can be as high as, for example, California is $800 and a lot are in between. So it kind of depends on your state. If you're using an online service, the fees that are charged are going to be in addition to your state's LLC filing fees. So, pricing for online services can vary from, $50 to a few $100s on top of your state's filing fees. If you're working with an attorney to file your LLC, you might expect to pay, $800 to $1,000, maybe more depending on the state and complexity of your needs. So, that's going to be in addition to your state's filing fees. Most states require LLCs to file an annual report. And that fee can be anywhere from $50 to a few $100s as well annually. So those fees are going to be kind of the ballparks of what you might expect. One thing to discuss here as well, as we're talking about costs and how to set things up, is what's the difference between LLC, sole proprietorship, and S corp. So you may have heard of an S corp as a business structure as well. An S corp is taxed differently than an LLC. It has some advantages and differences when it comes to operation and structure. And it can often make sense to move to an S corp status once certain income levels are reached because of the potential tax savings. But the good news is you don't have to decide today. So as we're talking about forming an LLC, some people will say, "Oh, form an S corp as you start." You don't really have to decide today. Many business owners aren't aware of this, but the S corp is not an actual business entity. It's a tax election. So you don't actually literally form an S corp as a business entity. You elect to be taxed as an S corp. So you can form an LLC as you start out and then simply update your tax election to S corp status if and when it makes sense. So for this reason, a lot of business owners start as an LLC and then they elect S corp tax status later, which involves filing some paperwork with the IRS. And that's kind of the way to upgrade, so to speak, or to migrate to an S corp. So again, an S corp is not an entity. It's a tax election. You can file the LLC as the entity. And then when you decide it makes sense, you can elect S corp tax status at any time. So be sure to consult with a tax professional when doing this. They can guide you through that process. So ultimately, our discussion is how to decide if an LLC is right for you. Should I form an LLC? Here are some things to think about when deciding. So what type of business is this? What sort of liability protection do you feel is important? If you're operating a small, home-based business selling holiday wreaths, for example, an LLC might be overkill. There's, likely not a high need for liability protection because there's a low probability that you'll get sued over selling crafts, so that you're operating a business that goes into significant debt. So, if it's a very small, simple business with low risk, that may factor in your decision. The main protection of an LLC deals with liabilities or debts that the business incurs. And so in most situations, you're safe from having your personal assets seized in order to pay debts that your business takes out and can't repay unless you've put up a personal guarantee for those loans. So another main area of personal protection is through liability that occurs from, wrongdoing that the employees, co-owners, or the business in general, generically perform. So if the business is sued and found liable, then your personal assets, in theory, remain protected as long as you personally did not have involvement. So an LLC can also help protect you from liability from accidents related to your business, such as someone, slipping and falling at your office, for example. However, the LLC might not protect you from all liability, especially if you commit, wrongdoing or negligence yourself. For example, if you commit tax fraud or you intermingle your personal finances with the business, then that can kind of pierce that corporate veil, and your personal assets can be held accountable. So it's important to evaluate the risk, ideally, of your business activity. So what's the potential risk that you could be exposed to liability? The higher the risk, the more an LLC might make sense, so that you can limit that liability. Now, again, forming an LLC is not that difficult. It's fairly easy and fairly low cost. So, if you have any amount of risk or concern about risk, the trade-off is not that big. Like, filing the LLC is fairly simple and inexpensive. So, it's not like it's a massive decision. Another factor is growth. Is this a simple side hustle that it'll be just limited to just you doing part-time work, or do you ever plan to hire employees? If you plan to never grow beyond you, and it's going to stay a small sole proprietorship, it might just be just fine. However, if you can envision a time when you grow your business and hire team members, an LLC is going to be a better route. And so when moving from a sole proprietorship to an LLC, you're typically going to need to get a new EIN, and a new bank account, which and possibly update other elements of the business, which can be a little bit of a pain. So because of this, if you have plans for growth, then forming an LLC from the start can be a great way to avoid the hassle of updating everything later. Finally, what about credibility? Is it important to be seen as professional and legitimate by your customers, your clients? If so, having an LLC after your business name can add credibility. Having the LLC entity type kind of adds that layer of credibility that you're taken more seriously. You're seen as a more legitimate business, and that can be important to some. So in general, a sole proprietorship can be an adequate business structure for people running a simple, low risk business. However, many businesses and self-employed individuals can benefit from the protections and the flexibility and credibility of an LLC, and that's ultimately why it's one of the most popular business structures for entrepreneurs. So I hope that helps as you think through the question of, should I form an LLC for my business activity? All right. As always, you know where to find me, hopefully by now. If you're a regular listener, I'm at elevationfinancial.com. If you're a newcomer, maybe new to my podcast and my show, then great. I'd love to have you continue to join me. And you can find me online at elevationfinancial.com. You can email me at podcast@elevationfinancial.com. And no matter who you are, if you'd like to chat, I do a complimentary money session with anybody who has money questions. Feel free to reach out on my website through that friendly button that says book a complimentary money session, and I'll be happy to chat. It takes about 45 minutes or less. I answer any questions you have. There's no charge for it. Always happy to help. So with that, have a great day. Thanks for joining me today. We will see you next time.